Mark chapter 10. This chapter begins with Jesus teaching the people. And as he taught, he was asked a very difficult question by some of the Pharisees. Now, we would say this was a legitimate question and one that maybe many people had. And the interest in this question is confirmed by the fact that Mark includes Jesus' answer to it in the Gospels, in his Gospel. Mark does note, however, that the motivation of the Pharisees was not really understanding. They were testing Jesus and trying to catch him in his words. So the Pharisees' question was this: was it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And when Jesus asked them about what Moses said, they commented that Moses had allowed divorce. Well, when we study the background of this passage, we realize that there were differences of opinion about this in Jesus' day. Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verses 1 through 4 in the Old Testament said that a husband could divorce his wife if he found something objectionable about her. That's the exact language. The question, of course, was what does objectionable mean? Well, and there were generally two schools of thought in Jesus' day. One interpreted the meaning of the passage very strictly. Only infidelity constituted a sufficient cause for a man to put away his wife. The other school, however, interpreted things more liberally. There was almost no reason a man could not put away his wife if he wanted to do so. So this really was a tough question, and of course it was designed to put Jesus on the spot. It is interesting here that Jesus responds theologically, not primarily from human experience. And he makes his case from the Old Testament and what it teaches, and then he adds something to it. Jesus replies that Moses allowed divorce at all because of people's hardness of heart. That is, it was a concession to human weakness, not a part of God's original plan. And then Jesus went back to the creation story in Genesis. He said, "But from the beginning, God made humans male and female. For this reason, a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife. And in doing so, they become one flesh." And all of that comes from the creation account in Genesis. And then Jesus adds his own words. He says, "Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." Well, there are a lot of important things that Jesus says here. First, he says that marriage is God's idea. It's not a human creation or institution. God designed it and patterned it according to his purposes. So marriage is something that comes from God. Well, next, the woman is created from the rib of Adam in her creation. She is created out of Adam's flesh. She isn't made from the dust as Adam is, but from his flesh, and that is the basis for the statement that when a man and a woman are joined together in marriage, they become one flesh again. Marriage unites the man and the woman, and they become one flesh again. And Jesus also affirms that God's intention is for that bond to be permanent. What God has joined, humans should not separate. Well, it would be nice if Jesus' words here answered all of our questions about marriage and divorce. But alas, we don't have as much as we would like to have from Jesus. Mark says that the disciples had questions and they asked Jesus in private what this meant. And then Jesus makes a very clear but tough set of comments. He says, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." Well, there has obviously been a lot said and written about those comments by Jesus. Well, we don't have time to discuss everything that might be said, but let me just make a couple of comments here. In many ways, this saying by Jesus can be seen as in defense of women against the idea that a man could put away his wife for any reason. Jesus' comments would strongly condemn that idea. We might also note that Jesus puts both husbands and wives on equal footing here. A man should not divorce his wife, neither should a wife divorce her husband. Well, we also can note that in many ways the divorce law in the Old Testament was for the protection of the woman. That is, the issuing of a certificate of divorce allowed the woman to, if possible, get on with her life. It gave her the legal status of being officially divorced and able to move on at some point and not still in limbo, tied in some way to her former husband. In these statements here in Mark chapter 9, Jesus warns both husband and wife against divorce and places the emphasis on both of them to work for the health of their marriage. Well, the church has spent a lot of time thinking about these issues. Even in the time of the early church, Paul had to deal with the question of what happens in a marriage when one partner only becomes a Christian. What should one do? Should one divorce then, or should they stay married? And in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, Jesus seems to make an exception to this statement here in Mark. He says that the matter of adultery might be a sin so serious against a marriage that divorce might be allowable. Well, here's a set of teachings from Jesus about the ideal plan of God for people in marriage. We might wish that we had more words from Jesus about how to deal with the complications that human failure brings into a marriage, but that has been left for the church to reflect on and try to consider faithfully. Well, the next story is about Jesus blessing some little children. The disciples thought Jesus too busy to take time to give attention to children. He was doing adult things. But Jesus sternly corrects this misconception. He takes time with the children, he lays his hands on him, and he blesses them. He also comments that we need to become like little children, not childish or immature, but childlike, open, and trusting. Without these qualities, we are really not in the right place, mindset. We don't have the right attitude to enter the kingdom of God and accept God's grace to us. Well, this passage also reminds us that we should take care of our children, nurture them, and teach them. Well, the next story is typically called the story of the rich young ruler. It isn't Mark that calls him a ruler, but Luke does. And this means he had some position of authority, perhaps in the local government, maybe a leader in the synagogue. And Matthew says that he was a young man. So this is actually a sad story and a little bit of an unnerving one. Jesus seems to ask a great sacrifice of the young man. He says to him, "Go and sell all that you have and give it to the poor, and you will have riches in heaven. Then come and follow me." And Mark says that the man was stunned by Jesus' demand and that he went away sad, for he had many possessions. Well, this is also one of those stories that makes us wonder what expectations Christ might have of us. And if we had been in his shoes, what would we have done? Well, so it's easy to see Jesus as a little bit hard on the man. After all, he seems very sincere, and other than being wealthy, he seems a very good person. But I think the way to understand this story is to look at the flip side of what Jesus was asking of the young man. Consider that Jesus was offering this young man a remarkable opportunity. It was to become a disciple of his and perhaps even one of the inner circle of the early church. Now imagine if he had done this, if he had sold his possessions and followed after Jesus. Would we think this would have given him esteem and credibility in the eyes of the other disciples? And why did he need to sell everything? Maybe because the disciples might have looked at him as a spoiled rich kid if he had not, or maybe he might always have been tempted to go back to his life of ease. But if he had done what Jesus had said, certainly his life would have been full of faith and service and the adventure that was at the heart of the early Christian church. Well, the story ends without our knowing what happened to him. At this point, Jesus was coming down out of Galilee and headed toward Jerusalem. So this took place in the area around Jerusalem where the early church would start. It might be possible that this young man was one of those who in the days of the early church sold their possessions and laid them at the feet of the apostles to use in ministry to the church and to the poor. Well, we don't know, but we are left in this story to wonder. It then says that Jesus commented to the disciples that it was very hard for people with wealth to enter the kingdom of God. It's harder for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. To this, the disciples, some of whom had homes and boats, said, "Well, so then who can be saved?" And Jesus has a wonderful response. He says it's impossible with humans, but with God, nothing is impossible. And the church has traditionally understood a couple of things from this set of sayings by Jesus. First, there are dangers in wealth. It is easy to trust in our riches and not place our trust in God, so we ought to be aware of those dangers. On the other hand, with God, all things are possible. It is possible to use one's wealth, not just on oneself, but for good, and certainly many Christians down through the centuries have done so. Well, next we have another prediction by Jesus about His upcoming suffering. And notice that Jesus doesn't give the disciples all the details, but the basic facts. They will have to experience both the crucifixion and the resurrection to truly understand what the purpose was for which Jesus came. But Jesus wants them to know that this would be the plan of God and not some unexpected accident. Well, two more stories in this chapter. The first is about the request of James and John to sit at the right and the left side of Jesus in His glory. Now, Matthew's account says that it was their mother that brought this request to Jesus. Now, you know, our mothers are certainly always looking out for our good. God bless them. And so God bless the mother of James and John. But either way, the boys were certainly on board with this idea. Jesus asked them if they were willing to drink the cup He was going to drink and be baptized with His baptism. Maybe if they thought it was a cup of honor and a baptism of glory. Jesus certainly knew differently. And of course, they affirmed that they were willing. Jesus then responded that what they asked was not His to give, but what the Father would decide. But in fact, they would drink His cup and be baptized with His baptism. Now, of course, we can imagine that the rest of the disciples were a bit miffed when they got wind of this little private maneuver. But Jesus used the occasion to again teach the disciples about servant leadership. He hits this over and over. And as an illustration, He uses Himself. He says, I'm among you as one that serves. And of course, Jesus is the example that the church is to follow. Well, interestingly, this incident affirms that both James and John will in fact suffer for the sake of the gospel, and that is something they will both do, with James being the first of the apostles to be killed. His death is recorded in Acts chapter 12. He was killed by King Herod Agrippa I, and he was killed by the sword, the first martyr among the apostles. Well, the final story is about the healing of blind Bartimaeus. Perhaps the most interesting thing about the story is the inclusion of the name of Bartimaeus. We would wonder why his name is mentioned. Most of the names of the people that Jesus healed in the New Testament are not mentioned, so why this one? And it makes us wonder if Bartimaeus would be someone who would be active in the early Christian community. His name and story might have been remembered because he was well known in the church in Jericho and perhaps elsewhere. And perhaps appropriately at the end of the account it says that after he was healed, he followed Jesus on the way. And it is possible, perhaps probable, that that statement would characterize the rest of his life. And of course, may that be true of us as well. May we follow after Jesus in His way. Well, there's a lot in this chapter, Mark chapter 10, so read Mark chapter 10, and then we will see you in the video for Mark chapter 11.